This week on Jerusalem Dateline, ominous signs in the Middle East. Iran's new hardline president is inaugurated amidst warnings that Iran is just weeks away from a nuclear breakout. Rocket fire from Lebanon provokes a tough Israeli response. And Jerusalem archaeologists discover evidence of a giant biblical earthquake. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Ominous signs in the Middle East as Israel's defense minister warns Tehran is just weeks away from acquiring weapons-grade material needed for a nuclear weapon. As CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl tells us, that disturbing development comes as the U.S. and Israel blame Iran for recent attacks at sea. And the country has a new president, a man who has been sanctioned for murdering his own people.
Ibrahim Raisi takes over as the 8th president of the Islamic regime.
The sanctions imposed against the Iranian nation must be lifted. We will support any diplomatic plan that supports this goal.
Raisi spoke at his swearing-in ceremony where he touted his country as the true defenders of human rights and a force for peace in the region.
Iran's regional capacities back peace and stability in countries and will only be used to confront threats of domineering and tyrant powers.
Raisi is considered a hardliner, a carbon copy of religious leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and the first Iranian president to be sanctioned by the U.S. even before taking office.
Ibrahim Raisi is called the butcher of Tehran, actually, because he has a long track record of killing his own people, going back to 1988. You can say that he's probably responsible for at least 10,000 Iranians being executed.
Len Khodorkovsky, a former senior advisor to the U.S. envoy for Iran, says although the Ayatollah is the ultimate decision maker, Raisi won't give up much in talks to reinstate the Iranian nuclear deal, officially known as the JCPOA.
We can expect them to play hardball, and we're seeing them playing hardball right now through their attacks on our interests, through the attacks on an Israeli-owned ship just a few days ago.
Khodorkovsky says it's the Iranian negotiating style.
What they're sensing is that the Biden administration is signaling weakness. They're seeing that there's no price that they have to pay after each of these attacks. And in return, instead of playing hardball, the Biden administration makes more and more concessions.
Israel, the U.S., and U.K. are blaming Iran for the attack on the Israeli-operated oil tanker called Mercer Street that left 2 Europeans dead. Iran denies its involvement. Israel is trying to rally international support for sanctions against Iran, but some 70 countries and the European Union attended Raisi's inauguration. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said they shouldn't be there.
Raisi is the most radical Iranian president so far, and the competition is tough. I call on the European Union. One cannot talk about human rights and at the same time pay homage to a murderer and a hangman who has eliminated hundreds of opponents of the regime.
Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid briefed ambassadors from UN Security Council member states on Iran's involvement in the Mercer ship attack and its nuclear plans. Iran has violated all of the guidelines set in the JCPOA and is only around 10 weeks from acquiring weapons-grade materials necessary for a nuclear weapon. Therefore, it is time to act. The world must apply economic sanctions and take operative action against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
The Iranians need to understand that it is impossible to sit peacefully in Tehran and from there ignite the entire Middle East. That is over.
Israel has long said it will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons, and now that it seems the clock is ticking, Israel will have to decide how far it will go to stop it. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Now, more on that attack of an Israeli-managed ship off the coast of Oman. The attack represents the latest incident in a period many are calling the war between wars. Israel says an Iranian suicide drone armed with explosives hit the Mercer Street ship, killing its Romanian captain and a British security officer. An Israeli-owned company manages the vessel, and on Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett warned Iran.
So I stayed here absolutely. Iran is the one that carried out the attack against the ship. Iran's aggressive behavior is dangerous, not only for Israel, but also harms international interests, the freedom of navigation, and the international trade. The intelligence evidence for this exists, and we expect the international system to make it clear to the Iranian regime that they have made a grave mistake. In any case, we know how to convey the message to Iran in our own way.
In a statement, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken blamed Iran for the attack and stated, "We are working with their partners to consider our next steps and consulting with governments inside the region and beyond on an appropriate response, which will be forthcoming." While Iran denied responsibility, the attack is the latest in a series of strikes at sea between Iran and Israel. In the meantime, Ibrahim Raisi will be sworn in as Iran's new president on Thursday. Called the hangman of Tehran for his involvement in the death of thousands of Iranians, it remains to be seen what impact he will have on negotiations over the renewal of the Iranian nuclear deal. Talks have been suspended for the past 6 weeks. U.S. Secretary Blinken says the delay can't go on forever.
The ball remains in Iran's court, and we will see if they are prepared to make the decisions necessary to come back into compliance. We are committed to diplomacy, but this process cannot go on indefinitely.
Hezbollah fired at least 19 rockets at Israel's Golan Heights. Most of them were intercepted by Israel's anti-missile system. The Iranian proxy said it was in retaliation for Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon a few days earlier. Israeli fighter jets hit rocket launch sites inside southern Lebanon after those rockets were fired from Lebanon into northern Israel. The first rocket attack came on the first anniversary of the massive explosion that rocked Beirut. The Israel Defense Forces released this footage of its attack on rocket launch sites in Lebanon. 2 rockets struck inside Israel. 1 rocket hit an open area near Kiryat Shimona, a community of about 20,000, and another was intercepted by the Iron Dome anti-missile defense system. Observers believe a Palestinian group launched the rockets, but the Israel Defense Forces warned Lebanon it would be held responsible for any attacks from its territory. The attacks came as several thousand Lebanese marked the 1-year anniversary of the horrific explosion at Beirut's port. The head of Lebanon's Maronite Catholic Church called for accountability for the explosion.
We're here to demand truth and justice. This land will remain a stain until we know what happened in the Beirut port.
The catastrophic blast tore through the city and accelerated Lebanon's descent into a failed state. The worst crisis, some say, since the 19th century. Lebanon suffers from fuel shortages, power blackouts, lack of medical supplies, and a financial crisis where the currency has lost most of its value. The country hasn't had a functioning government for months. Many blame a corrupt, dysfunctional political class for the crisis. The other culprit, some say, is the Islamic terrorist group Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran. This Lebanese journalist called Hezbollah an occupying force of Iran and blamed the terror group for destroying what was once called the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Lebanon used to be the hospital of the East, the University of the East, the School of the East, and the Bank of the East. Hezbollah has destroyed everything. We no longer have hospitals. Our hospitals are being shut down because they have no fuel. All the university professors immigrate from this country.
With Lebanon on the verge of collapse, Middle East analyst Jacques Neria believes the country could be ripe for a takeover by Hezbollah.
I think that the only ones who will be the winners are Hezbollah, because economically, financially, they are best organized, and they are assisted by Iran, who just sends millions of dollars to Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has already created a parallel state, and it will take no time for Hezbollah to take over if such an instruction is given by Tehran.
The fall of Lebanon would have disastrous consequences for Israel and the Middle East, including more attacks and warfare against the Jewish state in the future, and giving Iran more power in the region. Coming up, can Iranian protesters throughout the Islamic Republic bring down the regime? Len Khodorkovsky is a former senior State Department advisor to the U.S. envoy for Iran. I spoke with him in our Jerusalem studio about the current situation inside Iran. Len Karakovsky, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Thanks so much for having me.
In the last couple of weeks, we've seen protests that started in one province that has spread to different parts of Iran. How significant are those protests right now?
You know, it's hard to say what is going to be the last straw that breaks the regime. You had a buildup of protests over various decades. They've ramped up over the Trump administration. In fact, in November 2019, the protests in Iran were probably the most significant pressure on the regime internally since 1979. The regime ended up massacring 1,500 Iranians and turning off the internet. This is the playbook that they're using right now as well. People were out protesting because they're thirsty. The regime is so corrupt and inept that it has basically taken a country that's rich and has plenty of resources and made it a desert. Unlike Israel, may I point out, which has created water out of a desert. What you're seeing is, again, intermittent pressure from the people who are going out. The regime no longer has legitimacy among its population, and the only way it controls the population is through brute strength, by turning off the internet, therefore trying to prevent the messages to go out to the free world. But they can't control it. You know, we're seeing images out of there. We're seeing social media being very active. There's reporting going on. Whether it is a mortal threat to the regime, it's hard to tell, but I'm confident that the regime is destined to end up on the ash heap of history, whether it's tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now.
We talked before about something, you mentioned sort of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the new Abraham Accords, potentially Saudi Arabia will come and be part of that. But you also talked about something called the Cyrus Accords. What are they?
Cyrus Accords is a concept based on 2,500 years of friendship between Jewish people and Persian people, going back to Cyrus the Great, who was a great Persian king who liberated the Jews from Babylonia, allowed them to come to Jerusalem and helped them build a second temple. So there's a long history of friendship, and the last 40 years of the Islamic Republic is just a historic anomaly. So we foresee a time when we can recapture that friendship and allow people of Iran and people of Israel and the United States to create a peace that will reinvent the way the Middle East works. Because if you're trying to solve the Middle East, you have to solve Iran. And in order to solve Iran, I think you have to empower the people to see the benefits of what that could look like.
Final question, Len. What can the West do? What can the U.S. do to facilitate freedom in Iran?
Number one, we need to be supportive vocally. So my personal story, I came from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I came to America. And one of the things that was really important for dissidents in the Soviet Union is hearing President Reagan be very forceful vocally in standing with dissidents in the Soviet Union. When Natan Sharansky, who's now an Israeli and member of various administrations here, when he was a Soviet dissident in prison, he used President Reagan's and other Americans' support for the Russian dissidents as strength to help them survive in prison. So number one, we need to be vocal and support the Iranian people and recognize that the Iranian people are not the same as the regime that rules over them. Number two, there are practical things that we can do that we've done from the American side. During the protests a couple of years ago, for example, we helped Iranians bypass the censorship of the regime. There are any number of programs, both overt and covert, that help Iranians practically. So I would call on our European allies, I would call on all of our allies to look at ways to do that. And finally, I would say the way to change the regime's behavior is to put more pressure on it, which is the opposite of what's happening right now. And it would be much more helpful if our allies joined us in that pressure to deny the regime the resources to cause terrorism around the world, to develop missile technology, to kill its own people, to assassinate people around the globe. Remember, the State Department has declared Iran the top state sponsor of terrorism for about 4 decades now.
Well, a lot of people are hoping and praying for that. Len Karakovsky, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Up next, Dare to Believe, a new book about what Christians in the Middle East have endured during the last few years. Christians in the Middle East have been through a lot over the last couple of years. Like much of the world, they endured the pandemic. On top of that, 4 elections in 2 years in Israel and a war. CBN's Wendy Griffith talked with one man who's lived in the midst of it and is telling their stories of faith in his new book, Dare to Believe.
Terry, tell us about your new book, Dare to Believe. Give us a quick version of one of the stories in your book.
Oh, gosh, so many. It's 3 stories in one, really. One is my own story of nearly 50 years living and working in the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Egypt, and other countries. It's also the story of a very courageous but unheard about church, and the stories of individuals that have given their lives for the sake of the gospel in these different countries. And I'm sure anybody reading it cannot but be totally inspired by these stories. And it's also the story of Sat7, the struggles of getting started and broadcasting just 2 hours a week to start with in 1996, and expanding to 4 full-time channels broadcasting in Arabic and Turkish and Farsi for Iran, and having a 24-hour kids channel broadcasting across the Middle East.
And Sat7 is still going strong, right?
Very strong, thank you, yes.
And where are you located?
Well, the headquarters is in Cyprus, but we have studios in Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, London, where we do a lot of work for the Iranian channel, because we're not able at the moment, at least, to produce anything in country there, of course, in Iran.
Terry, tell us, what do you see God doing in the church in the Middle East?
Gosh, yeah, there's been so much change over the time I've lived here. You know, we had no internet, no cell phones, nothing when we started. And now we have all this amazing technology that we can communicate with people online and so on. But God is really moving in people's lives, especially in the very difficult places. Iran has perhaps the fastest growing church in the world today, with well over 1 million new believers that are basically meeting in homes. It's an underground church, because since 2011 there's not been any Farsi language churches permitted to meet. Only traditional Armenian churches and so on have been able to continue. Algeria is another amazing story of a fast-growing church in the face of many difficulties and challenges. But the book is full of really stories of courageous believers that have done so much to further the faith of Christ and bring an understanding of the Christian gospel to those around them.
It sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read it. What do you want believers, or what do you want people to take away from your book once they've read it?
I think most importantly to understand there is a Christian community in these countries, Turkey, Iran, the Arab world. Some of them date their churches right back to the apostles, and they've got 2,000 years of sometimes incredible witness and survived persecution under Rome, under Muslim invaders. And it's a story that people just aren't aware of. We think the church has been exterminated in the Middle East, but really it's alive and well, and carrying on that 2,000 years of Christian presence and witness.
You've certainly seen a lot of change in the Middle East in your lifetime, and it's not over. Terry Escott, author of Dare to Believe. Thanks for bringing us these powerful stories of what God is doing in the lives of Christians in the Middle East. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Still ahead, a biblical earthquake uncovered in Jerusalem. Archaeologists excavating here uncovered what they believe is evidence of the destruction of a massive earthquake from 2,800 years ago that's mentioned in the Bible. Take a look at what they found in the city of David in this video from the Israeli Antiquities Authority.
We are here on the eastern slopes of the City of David National Park, where excavations have been exposing amazing remains dating back to the First Temple period. To my left is the fortification of the city dating to the First Temple period, and to my right, a series of buildings which we have been exposing, which were originally constructed in the 8th century BCE and continued to exist until the Babylonian destruction in 586 BC. Very surprisingly, when we exposed the earliest remains within this building, we found a row of vessels, and from what we know historically, Jerusalem was not destroyed in this period. We began to try and think of what could be behind this destruction, and we found ourselves looking at the first verse in the book of Amos, which mentions an earthquake. Remains of destructions from this earthquake were exposed in various sites in Israel, but this is the first time where we find remains in Jerusalem which could be related to that earthquake.
The earthquake was so strong that the people that came to live here built on top of the destruction, which enabled us to discover all these beautiful finds, very small service vessels that were used to store liquids, and very large ones, one with unique handles shaped as a face. The people of Judah didn't forget this earthquake, and even 200 years later, the prophet Zechariah mentioned it.
If this is in fact related to the earthquake mentioned in Amos, this is the first time where such remains have been found in Jerusalem relating to the earthquake that was noted in the biblical text.
Well, that's more evidence of how archaeology is validating the Bible and the Jewish connection to the land of the Bible. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blast so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time.